Good evening. My name is Justin Shubow. I'm president of the National Civic Art Society. Our organization, together with the American Conservative, are glad you can join us at the Cosmos Club in Washington, D.C. for a panel discussion on authenticity, beauty, and human well-being, why there cannot be good urbanism without good architecture. Founded in 2002, the National Civic Art Society is a Washington, D.C.-based nonprofit that educates and empowers our leaders in the promotion of public art and architecture worthy of our great republic. We do so by advocating for the classical tradition in civic design, including the design of monuments, memorials, federal buildings, and U.S. courthouses. We are mindful of Winston Churchill's famous saying, "We shape our buildings, thereafter our buildings shape us." Our website is www.civicart.org. Tonight's panel is also sponsored by the American Conservative, the flagship publication of the American Ideas Institute, a Washington, D.C.-based nonprofit that exists to advance a Main Street conservatism that opposes unchecked power in government and business and promotes the flourishing of families and communities through vibrant markets and free people. Through their New Urbs program, which is made possible by a grant from the Richard Driehaus Foundation, they host thoughtful dialogue on how to encourage a humane built environment. The order tonight is that each panelist will make a presentation one at a time. When all three are finished, Micah Meadowcraft, managing editor of the American Conservative, will lead a discussion among them. Time permitting, there will then be audience Q&A. Our first panelist is Buras, a veteran architect and planner with experience in strategic planning and architecture and transportation design, as well as research and lecturing. His design work includes the East Side Access at Grand Central Terminal in New York City and International Terminal D at Dallas-Fort Worth Airport. He's the author of the book, The Art of Classic Planning, which was recently published by Harvard University Press. The architect Leon Krier called it, quote, the mother of all planning books. Our second panelist is Michael Curtis, who is research fellow at the National Civic Art Society. A true Renaissance man, Michael is a classical sculptor, painter, engraver, writer, poet, and architectural designer. His major commissions include the history of Texas at the Texas Rangers Ballpark, which is the largest American frieze produced in the 20th century. Michael has also sculpted portrait busts for the Jefferson Building of the Library of Congress, the U.S. Supreme Court's Thurgood Marshall Building, and many other public venues. He is the author of the book, Classical Architecture and Monuments of Washington, D.C., A History and Guide. Our third and final panelist is Anne Sussman, an architect and researcher who is co-author of the book, Cognitive Architecture, Designing for How We Respond to the Built Environment, which was published by Routledge. The book won the 2016 Place Research Award from the Environmental Design Research Association. Anne teaches at the Boston Architectural College, and she serves as president of the educational and research nonprofit, the Human Architecture and Planning Institute. And with that, please join me in welcoming Buras.
Thank you very much, all. I am really humbled to be here, surrounded by so many good friends and really teachers and mentors. I see quite a few around here in the room. It is very moving for me to be here now. We're going to be talking about authenticity, beauty, and human well-being, and why there can be no good urbanism without good architecture. Does anybody know why there can be no good urbanism without good architecture? Anybody have any idea? Well, yes.
I have just an idea, which is that the architecture forms the personality and it helps understand who we are, where we came from, where we need to go. And if it's chaotic, what do you expect?
I think that's a great answer. Anybody else have any thought on that? I think it's even simpler than that. And when you look at a cross-section of a street, you'll see that there's more building than pavement for the most part in cities. Most of what we see on an urban street is buildings. Their visual neuroaesthetic impact is by far more dominant than that of the pavement. Pavement is kind of nothing, right? And let's not forget, and this is sort of culminating in what you said, traditional and classical buildings make up the best streets and places. So before we go any further, I would like to make some definitions, a little bit of clarity here. Classical, and classic. Capitalized classical is the name of a period or a style. Lowercase classical is a method, a really good way of doing that something. And then classic is the best of its sort, classic coat, classic blazer, and so on. This talk is going to start with the origins of modernism, because that's kind of where we start getting into hot water. It's going to pass through very quickly what we're doing today. It's going to talk a little bit about the science to correct errors being made and synthesize a path forward. My greatest interest really is synthesizing where we go from here and what we do with all this stuff. So back in the 1750s, there was a fork in the road. People until then had been it was clear that anything being designed was going to be designed for a pleasing experience. But people asked, is there some other type of aesthetic experience other than pleasure? What's the opposite of pleasure? Pain. So we can have an aesthetic experience based on pain or terror, and they called it the sublime. It's a very important distinction. The best example of sublime art is horror movies. You're completely wrapped up. Your senses, your emotions, your intellect, all wrapped up in fear and in terror and pain and so on. But in architecture, back in the 1750s, they drew what it could look like. And it was very large. Sublime architecture would be very large, simple geometry, infinitely repeated, and no ornament. That was Ledoux's library for France and Piranesi's Cartier, his prisons. Well, this is what we got today. Very large, simple geometry, infinitely repeated, and no ornament. Ladies and gentlemen, this is what the architecture of pain and terror actually looks like by philosophical and experiential definition. Sorry if it's a little shocking, but how did we get here? And there is the question of, it all happened after World War I, and the big trauma in World War I was the industrialized killing. Well, that wasn't the first war where there was industrialized killing. Civil War in the United States was the first major war of industrialized killing, and we're still not over it. And we're not over World War I. The survivors of World War I went into this kind of new world with a new man. Women were relegated to two-dimensional arts and crafts at the Bauhaus because Gropius thought they couldn't handle 3 dimensions. And the teachers were bona fide strange, like Mr. Eaton over there. There was even a guy who in the 30s wrote an article, "Ornament is a Crime." And if you want to learn more about it, you can read all about it in James Stephen Curl, Making Dystopia. In 1939, Norman Bell Geddes, the designer of the General Motors Pavilion at the New York's World's Fair, saw the future. He built the American Street in the 1960s. And this is what we have now. This is in Beijing. So we're in great shape. We're not only contemplating, we are deep in the future. But that wasn't it. Then we had World War II. Everybody came back with PTSD from World War II. The hallmarks of modernism became the dissociation and the hatred of all things classical, as if modernism was protecting the poor people from authoritarian aristocracy, while at the same time they were running after corporate clientele. By the 60s, we had a reaction to it. This is Pruitt-Igoe, the same architect as designed the original Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. Very large building, simple geometry, infinitely repeated, and no ornament. People simply couldn't really tolerate it. They had to work up the tolerance for it. We now live in a PTSD world. The impact of World War I continues psychologically. It's like waiting for the next bullet coming over the trench. Yeah, the text message is like waiting for a bullet. It's really amazing, but there are things in our lives where the parallels are there. And this is what we have now. Wolfsburg on the top left, something in London on the Thames, the other side of the Houses of Parliament, not far from there. And then the London skyline really is the poster child for architectural dysfunctional writ large. A voice of reason in all this has been Leon Krier. He has been a really great mentor and supporter of writing the book, The Art of Classic Planning. I wrote it simply because I was frustrated with the planning process. I just wanted to write, here, guys, do this, and just compile the stuff that had worked. Well, we've been building cities for 5,000 years. We have a pretty good idea of what makes them work, what to do. And everybody around the world has been doing pretty much the same thing. This is one of the first cities, Mohenjo-Daro, in Indus Valley. You can get around that pretty easy. On the other hand, we have been living intensively with technology for the last 200 years, have no clue whatsoever with what to do with it. And in fact, when technology enters the urban domain, it disrupts and it creates nowheres. So what modernist built environments have actually worked? Well, people around here say Reston, and it is pretty. It has a campus-like feel. It's in a rural context, or originally was in a rural context. And I'm talking about the residential neighborhood, not the new urbanist center, which isn't that bad, I suppose. But actually, Reston is more similar to temporary communities like hospitals, asylums, army camps, than anything urban. So we really haven't crossed that urban gap for a long, long time. So what has worked? The answer is the classical method. It's how we built cities before planning ruined them. And it's all based on the neuroaesthetic processing in the brain, where the environment of our emergence is being replayed through the art of good architecture. So we have at the Classic Planning Institute been applying, training, and researching the classical method knowledge bases. They include architectural literacy, classic planning, materials, and building methods. Nobody has built a traditional waterfront in probably 150 years since the Paris waterfront was completed. There's classic traffic planning. How do we move around without street lights and street signs and markings on the road? There's climatic, seismic, and pandemic resilience, which we know is found in traditional architecture. And then, of course, there's the design neuroscience, which kind of helps us. So values that are unique to the CPI is, number one, is that architecture is central to urbanism. Number two, we are genuinely holistic in the sense that we are working from a philosophically holistic basis of the unity of truth, beauty, and goodness. We are also uniquely into the integration of town and country. It's not garden cities, and it's not suburbs, and it's not sprawl. Town and country, they have an edge between them, and you don't want to walk more than half an hour from anywhere in town to countryside, which is kind of what happens in DC, certainly happens in Manhattan. You have the river and Central Park. Nowhere in town are you more than half an hour away from them. And then we've been discovering that crafts are essential. It could be that rather than everybody sitting behind a computer and living, finding their livelihood that way, manual construction might actually be essential for individual, for social, and even planetary well-being, because it requires different processes than the ones that are really harming the planet right now. So what we're doing is creating a synthesis, and this is This synthesis is of philosophy, aesthetic experience, and neuroscience. It's all in chapter 6 in the book, but it's not the first time this kind of synthesis has happened. The Greeks, by identifying this notion of the unity of truth, beauty, and goodness, actually defined what is holism. That original idea was translated by Vitruvius, who you might have heard of, and if you haven't, he was a Roman engineer. Engineers always save architecture, but the worst thing that's happened to architecture is engineering. He translated it as Fermitas Utilitas Venustas, which in English in the Renaissance was translated as firmness, commodity, delight. Today's parlance, this means durability, long-term adaptive reuse, and neuroaesthetic fit. The idea of that holism is that if we change one, we're changing the whole. If we are measuring one, we're measuring the whole. And this is where science comes in, because with science, we can measure. You have, every one of you in the room, will be happy to know, you have a beauty center right here where your third eye should be. And it lights up when you see something pretty. When you see something ugly, nothing happens. It's really amazing. It's a 0 to 10. It's not a minus 10 to plus 10. So we're looking at a scale that is measurable, literally measurable, and it conforms to what the experience that people have. In other words, it'll light up and they will tell you, oh, that was beautiful at the same time. But because it's a holistic thing, it's also measuring the utility and the durability of something, and brings into the conversation appropriateness, which simply doesn't exist in modern parlance, because everything has to be iconic, reflecting the time and reflecting the ego of the creator. So we're working on the neuroscientific validation of the classical method at the Institute. I'm working with Richard Taylor from University of Oregon, with Nikos Salingaros from University of Texas, and Anna Brielman from the Max Planck Institute. We're using multiple fractals, sequence of perception, attractance, avoidance in the course of walking, and the Brain's Beauty Center with the whole holistic business and the measuring and so on. All this takes us to asset allocation. What is planning? What is architecture? It's asset allocation. Where to put the bricks, where to put the sticks. So here we have a measurable method that can help inform us how to form things in a way that are beneficial for humans. Before we continue this, everybody here know what, does anybody, who knows what a fractal is? Okay. Fractals are things that, like you see the broccoli over there, there's the same pattern which occurs at different scales: small, medium, large, really big, really tiny. The Hokusai's wave is a fractal pattern. The ice crystal, the flame on the right. And then there's the Mandelbrot, Benoit Mandelbrot is the guy who brought fractals to our attention back in the 1980s. I see heads nodding. You're identifying yourself as such and such as. But the thing is that the landscape of our emergence was multiple fractal. The clouds are fractal, the mountains are fractal, the landscape, the rolling hills are fractal, the rocks are fractal, the trees are fractal, the ripples on the water are fractal. It's all fractal, multiple fractal, not one single fractal. It's multiple fractal. And these are processed in the first 50 to 100 milliseconds of any after seeing anything. And they immediately start this chain reaction of you're feeling good, you're feeling bad, you're releasing dopamine, you're releasing serotonin. So I'm officially in the drug business, and I help people release dopamine. And this is where we go to have large releases of dopamine, pretty places around the world that we all love, and they're all multiple fractal. And the way it specifically works in the classical design is, and here's an example of two. There is the aqua and there's the pink. The aqua is a differentiating proportion, large, small. The pink is a punctuating proportion. It's the It's the nail on the finger. It's the tip of the nose. It's the earlobe. It's the tip of the lion's tail. It's the tip of the leaf. Very common in nature. And you can see that these proportions occur. This is Doric order, Palladio specifically, Doric order. You can see that it occurs many times in different sizes. The way the brain processes this is the same way it processes a tree. When you're walking past Arthur Brown Jr.'s Commerce Building, your brain doesn't know that you're not looking at a tree. Going back to here, it's not only two. I said multiple earlier. There are for sure 5, maybe 7 such proportional systems going simultaneously. I'm not going to get into that now. But this kind of processing occurs in a cycle of 150 milliseconds as we walk. So every step you have 4 cycles like this, and it's like the little Google Streets thing, really get going and scanning. That's kind of what's going on as we walk down the street. And this is all research that we've been doing at the Institute. It's hot. And it's not on the press yet. We're working to get it on the press. This is what we've done in interiors, whether it's commercial or residential. And we are on the urban level, we're applying eye tracking and visual attention software technology that you're going to hear about some more later on for good urban spaces, specifically in the federal district to evaluate proposals for their positive contribution built environment. And this is how it works. This is the Eisenhower Memorial by Gary down at the bottom. And you can see that the eye doesn't know where to stop. It's all over the place. And ultimately where it does stop is nothing germane to that design. It doesn't tell you anything. Whereas in the traditional design, it's like a homing pigeon, goes straight to where you're going to see the inscriptions and the sculpture in a composition. How magical is that? So a few designs that we did for DC. This is a hotel for city center, and where some of the absolutely worst buildings in DC have been recently built, all operable windows and so on and so forth. When you're working in the classical method, you are actually creating something that's holistic, good for people. If it's going to look good, it's going to withstand the pandemic. This, ladies and gentlemen, is a design for the FBI block. It was requested by a council member a while back on Pennsylvania Avenue on the diagonal thing. It's a hotel. There are two wings that are commercial residential, and in the middle there's an opera. That shape is actually the same size as the Paris Opera. It's a huge block. It's the biggest block in town. So the only way we can get to the performance that we're looking for is through authenticity, designed for the Southwest waterfront, where if you're looking at it from the other side of the river, you're going to see a podium, a white stone podium on which sits the Capitol on top of Jenkins Hill. Maybe the flagship of the DC thinking that we've had is this project, the Anacostia River project, where we extend the L'Enfant grid to connect to Anacostia, take out the freeways, narrow the river to the same width as the Seine because the hydrogeological conditions are the same as in Paris, and throw a bridge across every quarter mile so you can actually turn this whole part of town into something walkable. This is, and all of this is done on public and on other kinds of land, not so much on private. This is what the Anacostia could look like in 50 years if we really wanted it. So this is asset allocation. That's what we do for the best human experience, and takes you to a recognition that is maybe striking, that the purpose of urbanism is to create a legacy of beautiful places for people. Now that's saying something. So we learned how we got here. We learned what science says. We know what we need to do. And the question is, if classic planning, how we built cities before, is the future of urbanism. Straight ahead. Join the movement. Buy the book. Call on us. Make beautiful. Thank you. Thank you.
I prepared my remarks because I'm speaking extempore. I go on and on. And I found when I printed them, I had to enlarge them 2 font sizes, even with my glasses. So there'll be a couple of pictures of what I make, but that's not what I will be speaking of tonight. Authenticity, beauty, and human well-being, architecture and urbanism, which was our charge. When asked to join this panel, I wondered, what might I, an old craftsman, contribute to a discussion of architecture and urbanism? Yes, I've tinkered with civic planning, designed some little houses, some over large. Even so, I wondered, authenticity, beauty, and human well-being, architecture and humanism. I wondered, and there it was. Well, here it is, human. Our first question, que sumus? What are we? What is appropriate to creatures of our type? What is well, what is best for our being? Depends, I suppose, on what we are. Are we creatures of material only, or are we creatures of material and that something immaterial, let us say soul? The souled and the soulless are different things, different persons with different needs, different wants, differing expectations. What do you suppose we are, body or body and soul? Long ago, upon the shore of the wine-dark sea, some 100 years after Homer, 7 centuries before Christ, the pre-Socratics, the Milesians, Thales and Anaximander and Anaximenes, inquired into the nature of the all, of man, our being, postulated spirited atoms, and the cause of change, that necessary condition which brings all things into being. Before long, the man, spirited atom, and there a pun, would split, would change, would become 2 things, spirit and body, or merely atoms and the void. Socrates, by admission, claimed to be spirit and body, a body of physical form. That face which seems a papa solanus, and a spirit invisible, almost divine, a Platonic form, eternal in God, you might say. Socrates named his spirit a psyche, as Plato in the Phaedo on the soul relates. Democritus, contemporary of Socrates, late 5th century before Christ, insisted that all that is merely atoms and the void, and nothing more. His atoms you might conceive as molecules or as DNA, a thing inside the thing that models its form, a pattern, patterning, progressive change, you might say. Democritus said so, and he laughed. Plato, it is said, burned the books of Democritus, which I might believe. The immaterial, eternal, divine form and the variable atom are things so very different that one cannot exist if the other survives. And this, the cause of conflict, the cause of confusion from the classical age until this age yet to be named, a name that will be known when one side, the classive, or the other side, the progressive, prevails. As for myself, for accuracy, I name us, we of Homer and all that ascends thereafter, classive, a thing of one whole. True, we might employ the term occidental, the Occident, that side of the horizon, the west, where the sun rests. The Oriental, the Orient, that side of the horizon, the east, where the sun arises. If in Athens, which for the most part yet we are, we would have recognized that those people of the East are a thing remarkably different from the people of the West, the people like us, who know liberty of thought, of speech, of action, of property we earn and hold, property that we might bestow upon our posterity. Yes, well, we might say of all alike ourselves, Western civilization, those who reside where the sun rests, and saying would be, for the most part, correct. Should have mentioned that soul in Iliad is a species of warm breath, that invisible thing which is the life of the warrior, a warrior who, bodiless, becomes a shade, a shadow lacking moral force. An airy thing, a wandering in Hades, after the boatman is paid the fee. This notion of man, of moral force, of soul, spirit, shade, endowed eternally with afterlife, wants a description more telling than a word of place, the West, where the sun rests. Seems to me, classive, which incorporates the classical, encompasses more of who, of what we are, than does Western or classical. Here, I am put in mind of Thomas Jefferson, who, when praised for originality of thought, admitted that all of what he and the founders wrote could be found first in a people of one heritage, Aristotle or Cicero et alia. We are people little changed these 3 millennia, a people of one heritage, ascending by reason, by practice in tradition. Then, too, classive may best be employed when describing its opposite, progressive. These two ancient conceptions, progressive and classive, describe different universes, spirited and void, describe remarkably different creatures, creatures with wildly differing needs, wants, desires. The one, the progressive, a thing of body, will need appetite to be satisfied with air, water, food, employments to the flesh of belly, the flesh of brain, etc. The other, the classive, would too have its body satisfied. Yet, what feeds its soul? What air, water, food, employment does the immaterial want? What does mind need to be satisfied? The mind, the soul, to attain satisfaction, will want eudaimonia, happiness, well-being, that fulfillment by virtue achieved. Should mention, having distinguished the immaterial mind from the material brain, intelligent design, natural selection, and intelligent selection, yet haven't time sufficient for even a gloss, except to say, Darwin and neo-Darwinian theories have, after centuries, proved themselves to be mathematical impossibilities, failures that have an plausible answer to challenge. And then, since modern science, that discipline prompted by a pope in the 13th century, Clement IV, continuing until this moment, we have by experiment sought evidence sufficient to see and to understand the ineffable God. The notion that science and religion are at claws and throats is a myth invented by progressives some 100 years ago. Modern science, yes, well, modern. That old word that likes a dusting when drawn from the shelf was, in the 18th century, popularized by Jonathan Swift, of Latin coinage, meaning just now. A word that shall in every instance mean old, because in every instance of speaking, modern, the just now is past. The modern, the progressive, the classive, the classical, each describe a thing or condition that is unique. The classical describes, for the most part, Greek and Roman antiquity. For some, classical refers specifically to Athens of the 5th century. Modern describes, generally, the European ascendancy, the papal encouragement of evidence by experiment, the novum organum, knowing nature by proof. For some, modern refers to the machine culture, that historical period bookended by supreme nature and supreme information. The classical the modern, describe, for the most part, a time past, a people limited in number and in place. The progressive, the classic, describe conceptions, constructions of the universe, of the creature man, of what we are, of what we build, of what we might become. This becoming is the essential question of well-being. What is well for beings of a particular type? Souled and soulless beings are different types. Their cities are different. Their literatures are different. The statuary or structures are different. The souled, the soulless are different in every particular. Particulars of government, of neighborhood and home, of family and of friendship. All that is made, as you see around you, is formed for one type of creature or the other, for the classic souled man or for the progressive soulless man. And here we are, forced into answer. What is unique to the classic? What is unique to the progressive? Let us compare and contrast. Classic is that living tradition of beauty, an inheritance of liberty in thought, word, action. The classic was born in the search for goodness, for truth. The classic grew to become humane, in urbane harmony of health in mind and body. The classic abides in each person who acknowledges that the internal divine presence is found in creatures of our type and of other types divinely created. The class of trust in good recognizes the sublime divine in all things and looks to God for the ultimate resolution. Progressive is the assumption that through science, perfection will be achieved in body, behavior, society, by experimentation, through government. Progressivism is the belief that all the universe is material, that all materials can be known, that when by science all is known, science will find its end, and all problems will be resolved. Progressive assumes that this universe and all possible universes are material, physical. Classics assume this universe to be dual, both physical material and spirited metaphysical. An assumption of the physical, all that is, or acknowledgement of a metaphysical all that is, forms a person's being for well or ill, forms society, government, our monuments and memorials, our architecture and urbanism. You might accept a progressive worldview. You might enjoy a classic worldview. Each view matters for all the world. Classic artists conceive all that is or might be in idea. Progressive artists reduce all to material. The classic reveals the world of story, discovery. The progressive tells the world in fact, statement. For example, reference the classic National Gallery of Art, the NGA West Building, the progressive NGA East Building, one a habitation for souled man, the other an environment for the soulless. As you see, the progressive offers no telos, no mark, no end or purpose. You will recognize that progressive objects are empty spiritually, that the meaning of the thing is the physical thing itself. You will notice that the class of statue is filled with spirit, genius that swells, that gives meaning, purpose to the forms. And yes, class of statues are beautiful, humane. Progressive objects are, most often, iron, rusted, bent steel, or twisted colored plastic devoid of internal spirit, of personality, being, as they are, material substance, and nothing more. As you see, the progressive offers no telos, no mark, no end or purpose. The classic has purpose, cause, intention. It is a thing alike ourselves, bilateral, for the most part, tripartite, ordered, filled with life, healthy, reasonable, intelligible, alike God's universe, meaningful and good. The progressive is, by definition, soulless, stuff and the void. The class of is, by definition, souled, imbued with spirit. Classic and progressive artists create different things to different purposes. The class of artists creates ideas, pictures, places for souled persons. The progressive artist makes statements, objects, structures for biological creatures, soulless. Class of artists are inventive, are attentive to the souls of fellow men, of life beyond body, of good and evil, etc. Classes are interested in the ends of all which is, that which is best for the soul of man. Tell me, in which building are you at home? In which building do you belong? Which building is healthy? Which sick? Which building honors you? Which mocks you? You know the answer. No need to admit to me. Well, you do. The progressive materialists matter only, and the class of dualist, matter and spirit, portend different ends, different artists. Implications of worldview are obvious. More in building and collecting patterns of progressive materialists, industrialists, technologists, corporations, those of the knowledge class, university, media, government, than in artists, the majority of whom are classes, and so are ignored, absent from museums, banned from public places, written out of the history of art. Why? Progressives are single-minded, troubled by complexity. And besides, where would the recent 4 generations of class of artists fit into the East Wing vacuum? Pei did not put in enough art closets, and darn it, the old-fashioned progressive mods would be crowded out. To study antiquity is to study the past. To study the modern is to study the recent past. To study the classic is to study the past, the present, the future. The beautiful, the good, the true are always present, always classic. There has never been a new classical, except perhaps in the first realization by the ancient Greeks that, in fact, the beautiful, the good, the true exist. Both the classic and the progressive are current, are contemporary, and both ascend from antiquity. Yet, the progressive denies its antiquity, while the classic acknowledges its tradition. Apart from the corporeal world, all that we see was, in the first instance, designed by an artist. Our civilization is an aesthetic construction, formed of ideas that form and reform us. We cannot, in fact, say that competing progressive and classic philosophies resolve themselves into political parties. Neatly, they do not. Yet we do observe that opinions, conceptions of the universe, form persons, monuments, memorials into parties social and political. Here, I should mention, Aristotle did not say man is a political animal. Aristotle said man is a social animal, as are bees and cows. Yet, an animal who lives in a polis, intending that we live, or should live, in a physical environment suitable to our nature. The question before us, what is our nature? What is well? What is ill for beings of our type? I leave to you with the additional question, are we merely progressive, physical creatures? Or are we classic, divine creatures that transcend the physical? The answer to this question will determine how we shape our monuments, our memorials, our city, and our future. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Ann Sussman, and I'm really thrilled to be here. Thank you, Neer. Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Michael. You guys are a tough act to follow. So we'll just start. So what I'm going to be talking about is kind of give you the science that gives you the explanation of why traditional and classical architecture work and make the best urbanism and why they always will. So what's amazing, we are in an amazing time. The 21st century is absolutely amazing. not just because of COVID, but for lots of other reasons. It's such an amazing time in terms of the new understanding in biosciences that the OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, they actually claim that we're in a new century, the age of biology versus the 20th century, which is the age of chemistry and physics, the 19th, the age of engineering. And I just actually stole some of their slides. I'll show them to you really quickly. 19th century, the age of engineering. You recognize the Eiffel Tower. You recognize for the first time we get trains and bicycles and cameras. 20th century I was born in, we get, oh my gosh, plastics. Who knew? We get radar. We get the first computers. We split the atom. But now we're in a different time. We're in the 21st century. And we're in the age of biology. I live in Boston. In Boston, real estate around Kendall Square, where they have biotech, is just exploding because so much money, billions of dollars, are going into biotech research. And we now, what this paradigm shift does, it allows us to, well, we deconstructed the human genome. We figure out, we now have actually solved that. We did that in I think 2005. We can figure out how to make a red strawberry blue. You can actually run a marathon without having legs. Imagine paradigm shifts shift how you see yourself, and paradigm shifts, as the famous thinker Thomas Kuhn said, they occur across disciplines. The paradigm shift that's going to happen in architecture right now is going to be mind-boggling. I'm going to show you some of it. I'm going to take a famous building. Anyone recognize it? Villa Rotunda by Palladio, built at the end of the 16th century. And we can now do eye tracking. We can actually show how people look at this building. So we now have the technologies. These are technologies. I'm using the same software that Honda, BMW, GM, Procter & Gamble use. This is technology provided by iMotions. And this is actually going to see how the stimuli enters the person's brain. The big yellow dots are called fixations, and the lines are called saccades. If you're in business school at American University or Worcester Polytechnic, you're going to use this kind of software because you need to know when you design a business card and add, I don't know, a Pampers box. You need to know exactly how the person takes in the stimuli to be able to control their behavior, in this case, to make a purchase, right? So when you apply it with architecture, you learn that everyone looks at the world a little differently. And so what happens, the people who do this kind of work, the Honda, BMW, GM, Procter & Gamble, they will set up a lab with 30 to 35 people at least looking at every image so they can get the stats on exactly how things are looked at, so they can determine what to do to make sure they have the advantage in your behavior towards the product. And so what they'll do, they're really into stats. So when you look at this building, I had let's see, 33 people looking at it, and I can tell where they look 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You can see that without conscious awareness, when people really look at Palladio's building, they'll look at the statues on the building. One could actually make the argument that if there hadn't been so many statues on the building, that building wouldn't be as famous. So this is how the setup. I'm using iMotion software, and when you go on the iMotion's website, you'll see all the companies that use them: Honda, BMW, GM. Basically, humans don't really see reality. We see the reality that nature's arranged us to see after 3.8 billion years of evolution. And the big companies, they understand that. They buy evolution and they design for it to maximize manipulation of us. And what they're studying, so I just showed you eye tracking, but the companies that have money, they'll also study your brain waves to see if you want to approach or avoid something. They'll study the amount of times you smile. There's facial expression analysis software, which can tell how many times you're smiling, if you're frowning, so that the software can detect your feelings before you're consciously aware of them. It's pretty cool software. It's a little scary. They do heart rate, and they also do galvanic skin response. That's how your electrical charges change without conscious awareness, depending on what you're looking at. So basically, we're in an AI world where everything but our cities is being designed for our bodies. It's kind of fantastic. And so the big idea here is, you can't quite see it here. There's a great quote by Freud, famous psychiatrist. The mind is like an iceberg. It floats with 1/7 of its bulk above water. All modern designers using UX labs, user experience labs in tech companies like Apple, Huawei, car companies, they're using user experience labs. So they're designing for the unconscious, the brain you don't know you have, to be able to completely manipulate your behavior. It's really fascinating. This is actually from a website. I just pulled it up for a website on designing websites. 95% of our brain activity is beyond our conscious awareness. If you're going to design a good website, you've got to understand how the unconscious brain works. All of our conscious thoughts and actions are unconscious first. That's from Eric Kandel, Nobel Prize-winning neuroscientist, from his best-selling book, The Age of Insight. And this also is information theory. If you're doing design today, you need to know that 11 million bits, that's a unit of information, come into your brain every second, okay? And 10 million are visual when you're awake, 1 million is touch. So if you ever go into an Apple store, my students study the Apple store interior design. Everything is designed by PhD neuroscientists. Touch is very important. None of the iPhones will be in a package because when you touch something subliminally, the hunter-gatherer brain feels like you own it. So Apple really gets you. Okay. And this is again, we're starting to, you see this I saw in the supermarket about 6 months ago, The Science of Emotions, Time magazine. So when I went to architecture school, emotions were never mentioned. On the licensing exam, when I became a licensed architect, emotions never mentioned. It's not how everything else is happening today. You're talking about emotions all the time, even on the supermarket shelf. And then this woman has, she's a neuroscientist who used to work at Harvard. She says, although many of us may think of ourselves as thinking creatures that feel, biologically we're feeling creatures that think. And that idea of the precedence of emotional experience is huge. In fact, at Harvard Business School, students now study emotional intelligence. This came out in 2018. Imagine that. You're going to take a course in empathy. You're going to learn that bosses who are more empathetic will actually have more successful companies. Who knew, right? Empathy wasn't a word that ever came up in my architectural education in the 20th century. This is part of the paradigm shift that to design today, you need to be able to talk about emotions. Okay, so how the age of biology reframe architecture. So you can, here's a little video. What's incredibly powerful about the technology that's available today is that you can actually see how building details impact how people look at things. So this is kind of amazing. You can see that the arched windows around the library's front door, this is a public library in the city of New York, will influence how she looks at the building and will influence her behavior without her conscious awareness. So this is in like 15 seconds, what she did. In this case, we photoshopped out the windows, and without conscious awareness, his brain will not let him look at the building the same way. What happens is the brain is hardwired to avoid blankness. It's really interesting. So he won't be consciously aware of this, and he won't even be knowing he's doing this, but I'm eye tracking him. I know he's doing this. And so I've asked people, where do you want to wait while I go park the car and you wait with the 4-year-old with the books? Do you want to wait in front of the library with the windows and one without? Where do you think people want to wait? The one with the windows. Yeah, and they won't know why, but I have an idea why. They can have the fixation, they feel more attached to the building on the right subliminally. It's exactly what Freud said, the mind is an iceberg. And I can see now why. You understand how design happens today in the 21st century? Okay, so this is, again, they really get into stats, these guys. It's not opinion. It's not what Justin wants. It's not what Near wants. They really use the science. They can see that the TTFF is called time to first fixation. If you do eye tracking, you really follow that. So you see the front door faster in less than 1 second when it doesn't have windows versus 1.2 seconds. But what happens after 12 seconds, you're already looking, your brain is making you, without conscious awareness, look beyond the building when it doesn't have windows. Whereas when it has windows, by 13 seconds, you're looking back at the building. The unconscious brain directs your experience. You understand what Honda, BMW, GM are doing? Get it? They know you better than you know you. So does Apple. Okay, which is preferable? Where do you think people would rather hang out? On the right or the left? But now I can know why. Before it's built. So this we only did as a pilot study with 10 people. Without conscious awareness, your brain makes you look down the street when there's no detailing on the building. When there's the Matisse-like print, your brain will make you look at the building and not down the street. Incredible, isn't it? And then it gets a little crazy. This is software called Facet by Emotiant. Enjoy looking at it. Apple has since bought it and taken it off the market. Basically, it measures how many times you smile when you look at something. And so you can see, like, in 15 seconds, 5 people smiled, 10 people. But here, when it has the detail, look what happens. Without conscious awareness, more people smile, more people release oxytocin, the hugging hormone, just by seeing that design. You can actually rate how designs chemically impact you now. Look at that. You could make the argument that kids would be happier walking to school passing that than passing the other building. Someone would rather have a lemonade stand in front of that building than the other building. They won't know why, but I know why. Okay, so you can, all this stuff, you can predict everything before it's built. So here, again, brand new building, New York City. Where do you think people look? The posters. Yeah, you guys are good. It was what's amazing about this is what you can see here, it aggregates in black dots where people look. People look at the girl in the sexy yoga pose. They completely ignore the modern building, even though it has a glass reflection. It's stunning. And then they look at the contrasting color of the bus, and they really focus on all the faces. And you can see here, it takes them 14 seconds before they even see. There's so much going on with people, 14 seconds before they even see the red light. This is very famous. Copley Square in Boston, IMP building, and recently changed hands. The new owners wanted to direct attention to the building. What did they do? What they did is they put a picture of a guy in Paris, a guy in France floating down a barge. Everybody without conscious awareness looked right at it. Because otherwise, the brain is hardwired to ignore blank buildings. And you can just run through these. One. Well, do you remember the image on the last slide? What was it? A mug? What was on the mug? A face. Could you read the mug? No, of course not. Now you understand the basis for the design of all Apple ads. It takes 60,000 times longer for your brain to process text than images. So, and so that's why Apple ads have maybe 12 letters in them. And if the more letters you put in an ad, the less likely your brain is to read it. You might have seen this. Giuseppe Arcimboldo, his stuff is in the Louvre. You got it? You laughed. So this is a face, but it's harder. You can still see the face upside down, but it's harder to process. That's called parts-based processing. It takes longer. This is called template-based processing. The template for the upright face is in the brain by the 3rd trimester of pregnancy for the fetus. That is the basis. And that is the basis for basically the human brain devotes more to face recognition than the recognition of any other visual object. This is the Nobel Prize winner writing this in this book. He wants to sell this book about neuroscience. What does he put on the cover? He's walking the walk, right? Got it? Right. And so most house facades, traditional house facades, look like faces. There's a reason, because it's embedded in us what we need to see. Okay. So this pattern is already in us before birth. All right. The guys at Amazon know, because they track when you're looking at books, they track what you click on. The number 1 book that you click on will have a human face. The number 2 book has a pet face. My first book, I tracked it. And the first thing people looked at were the faces of the 2 people looking at each other. And so when we did the second edition, I told the publisher they could not change that, and they didn't. Okay. Amazon logo, not at all arbitrary, total neuroscience. When you see a smile, blood engorges in your blood in special cells that are called face patches that read smiles. So you're already feeling happy without conscious awareness when you see a smile. That's why they're doing that. Okay, again, total manipulation. Car designers, we won't even go into car designers. They study this all the time. Cars got angry in 2007, and they're making them angrier and angrier. This is fascinating, though. Computer scientists study this because they need to design robots that work with us. So robots need to know how we work. This is from a computer science journal. The perception of faces is more critical than previously thought for how humans perceive the aesthetics of the environment and the architecture of house facades. And this is by a guy in the Journal of Computer Information Systems. Basically, you can't design a good robot unless you understand how face sensing people always are, even when they're around buildings. And so this really totally reframes architectural history. That's what a paradigm shift does. You now understand why Salamanca, Spain, World Heritage Site, medieval churches, the church was the power center. No wonder they put the 12 apostles looking at you. And when you walk in, people were illiterate anyway. And so you'd want to feel that the apostles subliminally were waiting to see you when you walked in. It made perfect sense, right? You understand medieval architecture in different ways, right? 2013 Apple Store, exact same design. People are 95% literate. Doesn't matter. Subliminal brain drives you. We might as well be in the Middle Ages from Apple's point of view. 2018 Apple, same thing. What happens when you put a big picture of a face like that, just like on the medieval cathedral, subliminally, it drives you forward. Oxytocin's released. You think the person's looking at you, even if it's a statue. You're going to go forward. Okay. You can take the person out of the Stone Age, but you can't take the Stone Age out of the person. That's basically it. Okay. And I won't go into this. Now, why do you think our brain always prioritizes seeing faces continually without our conscious awareness? Why? Why are faces so important? Why did Mother Nature say we have to look at faces all the time? Yeah. Survival. You got it. Yeah. Our ancestors that didn't recognize faces died. That's it. The past is never dead. It's not even past. It's a famous quote. William Faulkner, Working for a Nun. Past is never dead, it's not even past. Yeah?
So when you look at the face, it's friend or foe, right?
That's true too. That's true too. But you have to know it's a face because it could be friend or foe. It could be killing you. It could be loving you. You don't know. But so your brain is hardwired to look at it. Traditional architecture expresses externally our hidden internal brain architecture. Effectively, what it expresses, compressed, is our evolution. But it's even more than that. So basically what they now know, this is the polyvagal theory. It gets a little bit into the weeds of science, that we need to see faces. You actually need to not see your friends, your lover, your spouse, your children. You need to see buildings that look at you to regulate your state, because that's the downside of being a social species. You have to be with others. We evolved to co-regulate with each other. Stephen Porges, PhD. We need the houses that look like us. Okay, this is the Lampoon Building in Harvard Square. It was built like at the turn of the century in like 1905 or so, and it's one of the most photographed buildings around Harvard. So it looks like it's waiting to see you. So when you do a building like the Gehry Building here, when it doesn't have a face, it'll get a face. So before it's opened, the museum directors put the Jeff Koons puppy there before it even opened, because people couldn't, human perception is relational, they couldn't relate to it, right? And how did modern architecture happen? I'll be done in 5 minutes. So how did it happen? Why did buildings become blank and faceless? I never could understand that. What happened? Something's weird. So why did you go from like the carriage house, this is Sparks Street in Cambridge in the Mass, to the building like that? That's in a New York City library built about 10 years ago. And when you do eye tracking with 3M visual attention software, which is now a plugin for Photoshop, all architects can now use this, you see instantly that in the first 3 to 5 seconds, the new building is biologically impossible for people to look at. Their brain doesn't want them to look at it. Whereas the traditional building, the brain is going to focus on the eyes and where the door is, which is what you'd need to see. They focus on the windows where the door is, sorry. Yeah. So who are the fathers of modern architecture? You know who they were. So it's basically what happened is they were born in the late 19th century and they lived through World War I. And the impact of World War I don't know if you know this is amazing. When John Singer Sargent was 62, the British paid him to go to the Western Front and paint American and English soldiers fighting together. He did this in 1919, a year after the war. And so, but this is what's amazing about the paradigm shift. Now we actually know how trauma changes the brain, changes your brain architecture. This has only been possible since the late 1990s. PTSD totally rewires your brain and it makes you stay stuck in trauma. And so the big idea here is PTSD changes your brain. The big book on this, The Body Keeps the Score, by Bessel van der Kolk. And basically what happens is, this new insight is that the way we build we're seeing reality, but it's also our brain architecture impacts what we see and what we build. And if you have PTSD, you have different brain architecture. So Gropius's PTSD in his architecture, this is what I now teach. So this is Gropius's house in Lincoln. He got a job at Harvard in the 1930s. He didn't want to live in Cambridge. He wanted to live in a more remote area, and he built a building that looked like a bunker. That's an actual bunker on the Western Front today. And this is the house opposite. And the neighbors were really upset when Gropius built this, but Gropius couldn't understand why. Because with PTSD, your vision completely changes. Vision blurs. You lose the ability to take in detail. It wasn't only cheaper to build that way, you actually lose the ability to take in detail when you have PTSD. Okay, and this is what's mind-blowing. The section of a World War I trench, the section of Gropius's study, exactly the same. Kitchen is the same way. His bedroom, even more mind-blowing. So the men slept in the trenches in dugouts. They wouldn't sleep in the trench, they'd sleep around a sturdy doorway right inside. And so Gropius recreated that exact same layout in his second floor. So I showed this to a man who teaches at Harvard Medical School, and he told me, every single image here is PTSD. And interior wall construction, the randomness you see in modern architecture, you also see in trench construction. When someone's about to kill you, you're not going to think about detail. You're just going to throw things together really fast. Now, the amazing thing about trauma and fear is it can be subliminal. You can be out of the war zone, but your brain and body can still be stuck in it. And that's what happened with Gropius. Okay, I presented this at a medical conference, Modern Architecture is Direct Expression of Trauma, World War I Trench. I got absolutely zero feedback, zero pushback. Okay, Corbusier, I'll go very quickly now. Corbu was too blind to serve in the World War I in the Swiss Army. These are examples of his buildings. But now he's been diagnosed. All of the bios of him since 2008, Nicholas Fox Weber talk about his autism spectrum disorder. And that actually matters. When you have ASD, you see and process stimuli very differently. So here's an example, someone with ASD on the right, a neurotypical on the left. The ASD brain can't look at the eyes. There's a lot about this on the web as well. You can see now. And so this is what's fascinating. Someone with ASD will look right at the blankness that the neurotypical brain can't look at. It's fascinating. So when you look at Le Corbusier's work, you can see it'd be easier for him to look at that. That's why he was designing that way. So how did modern architecture happen? Relationally compromised people with atypical fixations came up with the approach, running from a horrible war, the worst war the world had ever seen, 20 million deaths, 20 million casualties, rushing to bury the past. So with this new book, Cognitive Architecture, the second edition, and this book both talk about that. World War I, trauma. Okay, so 20th century paradigm shift helps us understand why architecture needs to look like this. Why it's faced like, how, as a social species, it's preset what we need to look at. Mother Nature's a very serious designer. She's preset things more than we realize. These are all in Greater Boston. Most of them are now protected by historic district bylaws. You can't change them if you want to. You can't change them. And these are some of the books I talked about. Okay, and briefly, we are trying to get the word out about how humans actually function because there is a lot we have to learn, as my former speakers also mentioned. Okay.
As Justin said, my name is Micah Meadowcraft. I'm the managing editor at the American Conservative Magazine. I'd like to thank our panelists for their remarks. And my responsibility is to get us back on track time-wise and let them talk more mostly to each other. There'll be time to ask them some questions at the reception after this as well. I would like to ask first question to prompt your conversation amongst each other. Could you discuss the role of scale in human need? And are we creatures that desire scale? There was the discussion of sublimity by Near about sublimity's relationship, the terror's relationship to modernity. But I wonder also, the Romantics discuss sublimity as being encountered in the weight of a waterfall or the size of a mountain or the beauty of the ocean and its sheer scale. And so is it all terror, or is there awe, or are there other ways we can think about this? And are there ways in which it is both humane and classical to build at scale? I mean, especially because we are here in DC, a city of monumental architecture. So I was just curious if you guys could discuss a little bit how you consider the role of scale in building humane and beautiful architecture.
Those of us, and you can pick this up at the Classic Planning Institute, we teach architectural literacy. Rule number one is that everything comes in three sizes: small, medium, and large. And then there's stuff that's a little too large, like the National Mall is really large, but it's got edges along it that moderate that huge expanse. And specifically for DC, it is appropriate. And with starting at the Grant Memorial, poor Grant looking west, seeing everything that's way beyond, the whole idea of the mall is appropriate as a design element, is a very large design element, because this is a very large country. Tiananmen Square is horrific. It's just large. It has no character whatsoever, and certainly very little beauty around it. Zocalo in Mexico, huge. But they have an excuse there because the Mexican culture, pre-Columbian, was based on terror. When the conquistadors came there first time, one of them counted 150,000 skulls and brackets around the place. So the idea of fear and terror is endemic, as part of the basic culture there. So you can say that is appropriate. And I don't think there are a lot of other squares. So far as the romantic commingling of the beautiful and the sublime, yes, it occurs mostly in German, who also thought about this stuff. They didn't make the distinction. And we say something is terribly good. Well, is it good or is it terrible? So there is this sort of loop in the language that confuses things when it comes to what ultimately is a neuroaesthetic experience. So things should be human scale. Human scale does not mean little. It means appropriate for humans. You walk into a cathedral, your soul fills the space. Could use even more, basically. So I'm sure I didn't answer your question.
You did. Excellently. Thank you. Michael or Anne, would either of you like to respond, or to each other? Was there something that one of the other speakers brought up?
Well, I think when people like Jan Gehl, he's a famous Danish planner, talk about scale, you really have to talk about scale in reference to how people see the world. And so basically, if you get over 100 meters, it's hard for a person to make out another person. So anything over 100 meters, so like the famous is going to be not work as well. Your brain is hardwired, as I showed you in my presentation, without your even awareness, to look for people all the time. But if you get it too far a distance, it gets outside the human purview. And so the problem with most modern architecture, I'd say in the United States, is it's not designed for human perception. The way Piazza del Campo in Siena is, it's 100 meters by about 60 meters. That means when you go in the middle, you can see if your boyfriend's out with another woman. You can really see everything that's really important. And that's what we need. That's what we need. We're a social species. We need to see others. So we need environments like the narrow streets that you get, in Paris and old cities. They're really comfortable because why? You can easily make out a person's expression as you pass. That's what we need. Our nervous system sets the parameters for architecture. Unfortunately, modern architecture ignores that.
Yeah, and thinking in this instance of statuary, for instance, small, medium, large, right? Statuettes and statues,
Right.
Right? And so in each is appropriate, what is appropriate to the place. And so we find statuettes in a house, right? Where it fills that space. And you're right, so many buildings, your soul is enlarged to fill the inside of the space, right? And then a few things that we recognize about being in a building. We know that a door is too close if we hold our arms out and we can't pass through, right? The same is appropriate for a hall. What is appropriate to a city? And thinking of, oh, golly, the Statue of Liberty, right? What is appropriate to a nation? And so, right, I think that in this question, is it sublime? Could something be so big that it's sublime? I'm not certain that the size, except maybe the sky, as Goethe or somebody else would have thought, right? Which is probably what you have in mind. That apart from that experience of the sublime, I'm not sure that we can have a sublime without thinking of some of the architecture of World War II, especially the German architecture of World War II, that you can have a sublime in something like statuary, which is what I'm speaking of just now. But yeah.
Thank you. Now, a follow-up question. Do you think there's any tension between measuring by modern science the humane historical continuity of classical architecture? Obviously, thus far, it seems to be confirming presuppositions, but are there, and your presentation talked a lot about advertising and the use of neurology in advertising. Is there something inherent to these kinds of technologies that's maybe, even though it seems to be showing us that we're right, do you see any conflict or of view or of ends?
Look, when you start getting into biometrics, it's scary because you see we're really animals. Consciousness matters, but not as much as we think. And the scary thing is how the car companies and the tech companies all know that, but the people designing our cities and buildings don't know how people work. That's terrifying, I think.
Nir or Michael, would you like to respond?
Well, I have two things I want to say to Anne while I have the opportunity. One was that Samuel Cashwan, who taught at the Detroit Society of Arts and Crafts, where I later taught almost 40 years ago, he taught automobile designers how to design. And do you know what he did? He would have them model a human face, and that true story. And then he would have them turn it into the front of a car, and then he would have them turn it back into a human face. And that was Sam Cashwan.
He was brilliant.
Do you know Sam Cashwan? Well, no, he was. In fact, he was Lou Redstone's teacher.
Oh, really?
You know,
Yeah,
Lou
yeah,
Redstone.
Yeah.
And what was the other thing I was going to say? Oh, golly, the old mind. It's going. It'll come to me in a minute.
Nir, did you want to respond?
Well, architecture is been said that it's concretized music. And when we talk about architecture in the urban context, it's not just standing there looking at something, but it's really walking past it. So there is this temporal flow of all this experience that you're experiencing as you walk. And walking is the essence of anything urban because that's the measure. So how long is it going to take me to get there? How long is it going to take me to get there? How easy is it to walk? And what am I going to see on the way? So choreographing that experience, composing it is like composing music, basically. What was the question?
Please go on. Just, continue to compose.
The point I'm making is that all of it is being confirmed by science. It's not about presupposition or previous concepts. The whole Greek idea was that we can reason through everything. The modernist idea is that we can't, we're limited. So we'll have machines do the counting. And when the machines are done, they corroborate what we knew before through reason, which is wonderful. At the end of the day, we are reaching, I think, at the end of this first round of 5,000 years of urban building, we're reaching some kind of consensus that is validated by machine counting of stuff. I think that's magnificent.
Michael, did you remember what you wanted to add?
I did, yes,
Please.
thank you. So it was a small thing, but even so, more than 4 decades ago, I had opened my first art gallery in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And I quickly learned that the moment that someone touched it was when that's when they possessed it, as you were saying earlier. And that's when you go up and you say, lovely picture, isn't it? Can I wrap that for you? And, or would you like it sent? So at any rate, yeah, that's right.
So
As you were saying earlier.
Yeah, that's a psychological term that retailers know. It's called the endowment effect. And that when you touch something, because we are still hunter-gatherers and our brains have not changed for 35 or 40,000 years, what secured our survival in the past was touching the plum and thinking it's ours subliminally, immediately. Now it's going to do us in because we buy too many things, right? but Apple and retailers do the same thing. They know that when they want you to touch all the things because then your brain starts thinking it's yours to take home. Yeah, it's pretty scary.
Well, I'm sorry to say, I'm sure you all have lots of questions, but we do have a reception at which you can accost our speakers and ask them some of those questions. But we are quite out of time. So please join me in thanking our speakers for the presentation.
It was really fun talking to you. You did great stuff. Great stuff. Great stuff here.